Furina's introduction throughout the years has painted her as a fascinating point of contention when it comes to the current state of how she manages Fontaine. While other Archons were either antagonists or allies in their stories, Furina's position at the moment paints her as a morally grey character. As such, I want to propose the idea that Focalors' morality and motivations for doing what she does is nothing short of a coping mechanism. And with that, welcome to Focalors' Delusion, a speculation into Focalors' concept of justice and how that can affect the grander narratives of the Archon quest. I'll be diving into information that we know from the past of her development, as well as the new information we have now. Disclaimer: nothing in this video is indicative of the final product. So, before we begin, I want to set the scope and the limitations of this theory. It's important for me to lay out the cards on the table so that it won't get too confusing the further we go on. So I'll be cutting this into 3 core concepts: the masquerade of splendor, the harvesting of indemnitium with the people's belief of justice, and the denial of the prophecy. Each of these statements bleed into each other, so let's dive into it. Fontaine is the hub of all arts and music, the core of aesthetics in Genshin's seemingly archaic world. The atmosphere of Fontaine is definitely a whole new can of worms compared to the other nations, and it all boils down to the masquerade of splendor. However, Focalors' delusion stems from the idea of the masquerade, in which she believes in the image of Fontaine as the perfect settlement with little flaws. With all of these clockworks and gizmos, it's possible that Focalors' desire for the extravagant is simply a byproduct of telling herself that Fontaine is above the other nations. But what makes Fontaine's moral dilemma more fascinating is Lyonnais' referral to how society works in Fontaine. To see is to believe, and the world is the stage in which people dance on. As such, the masquerade of splendor may be nothing more than Focalors' consistent want for the twist of life to keep things interesting. This idea further stems from the first ever description about Focalor. Dainsleif mentions during the Tivat trailer that Focalor lives for the spectacle of the courtroom, and while she knows how to make an enemy of the divine, she seeks to judge all other gods. In turn, the Archons. So the core of the delusion would be the idea that Fontaine is in a great spot as a nation and that there is nothing to worry about compared to the others. You can also see it in the way that NPCs discuss Fontaine as the hub of beauty, in which the superfluous fashion is the norm. The Varanada Lazarite gemstone furthers this idea, and she is stating that by the laws of the tribunal, praise her magnificence and purity. But let's investigate this attitude a little further, because the next questions are: is this arrogance warranted, and why does she insist that the people of Fontaine have no sins? Let's start with the first one, because we've actually seen the Chief Justice talk about her in the past. We hear Chief Justice Nouvelet talk about the Dendro Archon's sense of responsibility, which is in contrast to a certain other person who is prone to hysterics. Focalor wasn't directly name-dropped, but by the context of the conversation, she is the safest to assume. We also do see in the Overture trailer that this matches up with her attitude, in which she demanded a real twist for once and that she was more than eager to see the aftermath of the quote-unquote finale of the Archon quest's trial. As such, it's possible that Focalor's higher-than-thou attitude is more so her own mask, in which she doesn't want to address the slightest possibility that her concept of justice is flawed. By being loud and flamboyant, she also invokes the attitude amongst the people, that everything was going to be just fine. But in turn, because of her delusion that everything is okay, she doesn't stop to consider how this actually affects the people around her, because Fontaine's not as pretty as one hopes for it to be. There's NPCs who have mentioned that pollution is rampant in Fontaine, of which the air is toxic unlike Sumeru's fresh rainforests. Yanfei also mentioned that the legal systems of Fontaine are complicated, and Xavier mentions in the Telltale Tales that certain long and arduous legal processes need to be edited. Patrice further mentions that the tiniest infractions can be considered a crime. Life in Fontaine is convenient, but it is also a hassle. So while the people do appreciate the luxuries of life, such as the higher quality living states and the numerous technological advancements, Focalors' true management of the smaller problems that stemmed from these innovations, like pollution, legal complications, and overall just security, is lax and dismissive. But moving on from this, I want to investigate the insistence that the people here have no sins. Why would she ever feel the need to push this ideology consistently, not only upon herself, but also for the system? For that, we need to understand the collection of indemnitium. Now, while it's important for Focalors' character to investigate the ideologies, Fontaine has materialized this concept into something more concrete, which only further justifies why Focalor is acting the way she does. There's an actual materialization of what justice is. Fontaine introduces us to the oratrice, a contraption that generates the main power source of the living areas of Fontaine. The oratrice is responsible for allegedly honing the belief of people on what justice is and creating the main power source. That's why judgments in Fontaine are a spectacle for public consumption. And with that, there's the possibility that she's trying to keep the illusion alive so as to not negatively affect the oratrice and its production of indemnitium. Indemnity is the base word for this source, and it means the exception from legal liability for one's actions. A fascinating parallel to the masquerade of the guilty, you know? And the concept of delusions of grandeur, especially if this is the main power source for a nation that thrives on the glamorous. But moving on from that, my theory is that Focalors endeavors to maintain this air that her ideals are perfect because she doesn't want to accidentally alter the people's sense of justice. It also doesn't help that there are now rumors of the oratrice having a consciousness of its own, and that it's making judgments based on the people's perception. Because AI working with people's rudimentary abstraction of a concept definitely doesn't garner any red flags, you know, like, I don't know, miscommunication. Anyway, so if the people start questioning the legal system and the reliability of their Archon's ideal of justice being tied into the laws of Fontaine, wouldn't the oratrice also adjust? Either it doesn't produce enough indemnitium because the people's trust in justice is compromised, hence plunging a majority of the court of Fontaine into an international blackout, or it alters the concept of indemnitium altogether to fit into the people's belief. And when that belief is corrupted, so is the oratrice. Something like corrupting the clockwork mecha, or something much, much worse. So it's possible that Focalors needs to keep this air of extravagance as to limit the possibility of contaminating the oratrice's decision on what its criteria for justice are. And maybe that's why the rules of Fontaine are complicated and absolute. The oratrice may have the possibility of consciousness, but does it have the capacity to feel for the people involved? If the answer is a no, then Focalors' legal system needs to adjust accordingly to mitigate any potential disparities. Like, you know, AI overthrowing the world. And the thing is, there's already seeds of doubt in Fontaine. The concept of corrupting the waters has already been presented in the storyline ever since the reveal of Rhodia's backstory in A Tale of the Lockfolk. Idia and Endora mentioned before that the current waters of Fontaine have been changed ever since the changing of the Archons. This was mostly due to the Lockfolk not acknowledging Focalors' rule, thus leaving Fontaine entirely. The result of this is that the waters have changed, from what was once waters brimming with love and life in hopes of connecting to Vat to pools of anger and hate. Because the Lockfolk themselves are directly born from the water's essence, and their life is connected to the water. So perhaps there are parallels between these two concepts, the Lockfolk's emotions being connected to the water, and the people's belief of justice being connected to the oratrice. Focalors' delusion could be a protective guise over the entirety of Fontaine, keep the people's perception of justice in court as specifically tied to the extravagant as possible. That way, not only are they interested in a good show, their perception of quote-unquote morals are well defined in the law. Keep Fontaine positively innovative and beautiful as well, so that people have no reason to question the current state of the legal system. It's all smoke and mirrors. The problem with this, though, is if the system she's pushing itself is wrong. And because she's so ingrained in her own delusion, she would be deaf to the people's pleas for change. Yet it's also possible that the reason she's so adamant on maintaining this mask is because of the prophecy. Let's discuss the other aspect of Focalors' delusion, which is the constant reassurance that the people bear no sins in the eyes of the tribunal. Dainsleif mentions that Focalors would not make an enemy of the divine, and this may go well with the idea that she's afraid of the prophecy coming true. In the overture teaser, Egeria further mentions that the original sin is the fairest, and for the sinners, they must make most of the final feast, for the curtain call has come. We also see in the trailer for Fontaine that there are underwater ruins that exist, which look very much like an ancient civilization. The prophecy is currently the biggest stake in Fontaine's story, and it has been referenced before by Libin indirectly. There's currently an era of disturbance that blankets the nation, as though the people are anticipating something big. The prophecy itself states that the people will all be dissolved into the waters, leaving the Hydro Archon alone on her throne. And for that, I want to return to the possibility of the sinner's punishment for Fontaine, in which the prophecy is alluding for the gods punishing Focalors for her rule. The concept of the sinner is a term that has been dropped consistently in Genshin Impact to refer to the ancient civilizations and their transgressions against the gods, whether this be through insubordination or endangering the current domains of the gods. We have seen Conrians be referred to by Kaya as sinners in his voice lines, and the people of Enkanomiya who were banished away into the depths of the sea were also considered as such. And this is reinforced by the idea that Focalors keeps insisting that the people of Fontaine bear no sins in the eyes and laws of the tribunal. She herself is afraid of the divine. So it's possible that her mask of intricate rules and a morbid sense of justice are simply ways for her to delude herself into the idea that Fontaine would never go down the path of sin despite all the technological advancements they're facing. Remember, the reason for Conria's fall wasn't the robots themselves, but rather the uninhibited use of knowledge without precaution on Rhindaughter's part. The concept of the sin and advancement have been so interconnected in the lore of Genshin that Fontaine's uniqueness of being a clockwork nation already teeters on that possibility that they're the next nation to face transgression from the gods if and only if humanity messes up. Which it absolutely can. Besides the aforementioned problems I've stated about Fontaine, maintenance of technology is almost non-existent, especially not from the institutes that are supposed to be facilitating them. As such, it's possible that the reason Focalors is so fixated on the idea that the people have no sins is because while she wants Fontaine to prosper, she doesn't want to invoke the wrath of the gods. But in my opinion, she's tackling this in the worst way possible. She's trying to have her cake and eat it as well, and this balancing act of hers is bound to fall. You can't just constantly invoke justice without listening to the people, and you can't just have technological advancement without addressing the consequences. All in all, Focalors' delusion is less about herself and more about her position as an Archon. To completely disregard Focalor as being a selfish god would be to remove a lot of the possible nuance that she has as a character. We also need to respect that she wasn't the original, meaning that she most likely had to instigate a lot of change that was difficult for the nation. This may be the reason why she's so desperate to hold on to the idea of perfection. Justice, out of all of the current themes, has an air of arrogance to it. While eternity, freedom, and contracts can be seen as neutral things, to declare yourself as the god of justice can be seen as authoritarian. Wisdom can fall in the same regard, but we know that Nahida's concept of wisdom also encapsulates knowledge in general. So for now, we need to be patient and see where Focalors' possible insecurities and love for the spectacular will take her. Now, we know that politics are going to be playing a spectacular role in this story, with justice and legalese being the star of the show. So if we were to ask what Arlecchino could possibly want from this place, my guess is with the oratrice. I heavily theorize that she has plans on instigating a revolution, and that would definitely put the people's belief of justice into a frenzy. When people don't trust each other, what more their god and their system. You know, that kind of thing. But we're just going to need to see what happens next. We do think that Tartaglia is going to be fighting alongside us, but I'm going to be doing a follow-up theory for that one. But now we move on to the limitations of this theory. One limitation that I saw while I was writing the script was that this theory hinges on the fact that the prophecy is a bad thing, which may not be completely the case. There's an old concept in Fontainian lore where the goal of the old Hydra Archon was to unite the waters of Fontaine through love by using the Lockfolk. What if this is also a possibility? Prophecies can be allegorical instead of literal, and Focalor being alone on her throne could mean that the people have banded against her ideals, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we do know that Focalor's own ideals have their own limitations. Another possible limitation to this theory is that there's little information about the oratrice at the moment, so we need to clarify certain specifics, like what does it mean for it to be harvesting the belief? Does it really have a consciousness? Does it really have a voice? Something like that. But that's it for me today. Fontaine is coming out tomorrow, or is already out by the time that this video is released, and because of that, a lot of the information here could absolutely change, and I'm going to be so sad. But nevertheless, in the event that there are going to be information that is changed from this one, I am really excited to see how Genshin Impact writes the story of Fontaine, especially with the nuances of the word justice. And nevertheless, I am excited to see all of you tomorrow, because I'm going to be probably streaming my own thoughts about Fontaine, because I just got the massive drop for all of the characters and I want to make a video on that, or maybe a live stream, I don't know. But nevertheless, I'm really excited to see what they could have possibly cooked up for the story. But anyway, my name is Aster and thank you all for chilling with me. See you all in Fontaine!